Greetings. We're back in the classroom today, in a sense. And I want to talk to you about Gauguin and the origins of symbolism. Gauguin, who lived between 1848 and 1903, lived a fascinating, rather turbulent life. I think you'd find any sort of biographical coverage of his life to be interesting, although I confess that the more you know about him, the less you may like him. A kind of a swaggering, confident artist who sought to be the center of attention. Um, and yet, without question, an original mind, a groundbreaker, an artist who had a strong influence on the later history of art. Let me take you to some images. Gauguin was born in Paris. His father was a liberal journalist and was forced to leave France when the newspaper that he worked for was suppressed by political authorities. You may recall that there was a revolution in 1848. Those were turbulent times. That was followed by an election. Napoleon III came to power, and then through a coup d'etat, took complete control of the French government and declared himself emperor. So Gauguin was 18 months of age when the family fled France and left for Peru. But Gauguin's father died en route. When they arrived in Peru, his mother then was a single parent with 2 children. And she had relatives there who were high-ranking political positions. And so Gauguin's family, his small family, enjoyed a privileged life until there was a turnover in political power, and they were forced to return to France when Paul was 6 years of age. Back in France, he attended a prestigious Catholic school in Orléans in central France. And then at age 17, he served for 2 years in the French Navy. At age 23, a family friend by the name of Gustave Orosa helped Gauguin get a job as a stockbroker in Paris at the Bourse, or the stock exchange. He lived a very comfortable life, made a lot of money in that position. He married a woman from Denmark. Her name was Mette, and had 5 children over the next roughly 10 years, between 1874 and 1883. Now, at the same time that he began work as a stockbroker, he began to paint as an amateur artist, as a Sunday painter. He began visiting galleries, using some of his income to collect works of other artists, and he began meeting other painters, forming relationships, one of whom was Camille Pissarro. From 1879, Gauguin began exhibiting with the Impressionists, and this was probably at Pissarro's invitation. Pissarro, you recall, participated in all 8 exhibitions, the only one to do so, and had a leading role in the organization of that period of time, and brought in a variety of artists, including later Seurat and Signac. Gauguin exhibited again in 1881, 82, and 86. So that's roughly the last 4 of the 5 Impressionist exhibitions. We're looking on the screen then at some early works which show us his interests and the style that he developed. And essentially these are works that we would label Impressionist in character. This is the Seine near the Pont de Iéna. So it's a bridge slightly downstream from the center of Paris. The scene is winter, obviously, and the dull light and the convincing portrayal of of the circumstances suggest on plein air painting. His brushstrokes are visible. We might label this naturalism, in keeping with the Impressionist style. Here are a few other works. This is Still Life with Flowers, subtitled Interior of the Artist's Apartment on Rue Carcel, Paris. This work reminds me of Degas' Woman with Chrysanthemums, in that it's a mixture of genres. The spectacular still life bouquet is in the immediate foreground and really commands our attention primarily, though we may be distracted or certainly notice and wonder what's going on in the background, where a genre motif is visible. A woman is seen playing the piano and cut off, you can see, partly by the piano itself, in the way Degas might do it. A man looks over the piano at her, and there are other items, objects, furniture of a domestic nature scattered about the scene. This kind of juxtaposition of different motifs that compete for one's attention is something that one sees quite often in Gauguin's work. Again, the brushstrokes are visible. We might, no surprise that this might be exhibited at an Impressionist exhibition. It's reminiscent of Pissarro, I think, somewhat in technique. Here is a study of a nude. Suzanne Sewing is the subtitle, and this dates from 1880. And then finally, I've got a landscape here, the market gardens of Vaugirard, dating from 1879. This was painted in the vicinity of Gauguin's home, having moved from the center of Paris out to the outskirts at Vaugirard. The bright colors, the somewhat flattened perspective, the visible brushstrokes, again, are strongly consistent with the character of Impressionism and the work of Pissarro, Sisley, to a lesser degree Monet. In 1882, the stock market crashed and Gauguin's earnings diminished sharply. And at this time, he began formulating plans to become a full-time artist. Of course, he had several children, and one more would be born yet. He had a family to support. So he was trying to navigate a career change in difficult circumstances. Due to money issues, he moved with his family to Denmark in 1884, and they moved in with his wife's family. Life there was difficult. He worked as a salesman, although he spoke no Danish. That had to have been a major problem. His marriage was strained. And so at the request of his wife and her family, he returned to Paris alone in 1885. He exhibited 19 paintings and a wood relief at the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886. This was the exhibition, you recall, where Seurat was the man of the moment with his painting of Sunday en la Grande Jatte in exhibition. Gauguin visited Seurat's work with contempt, and he subsequently broke with Pissarro. Now, Pissarro, you recall, around the mid-1880s, took up the divisionist approach himself. In 1886, Gauguin went for the first time to Brittany, and specifically to the town of Pont-Aven. Now, Brittany is the part of France in the far west, a peninsula that sticks out furthest into the Atlantic. And it was a place that many artists went to for a variety of reasons. It was cheap to live there, so their meager funds could be stretched quite far, living in these small towns in Brittany. They were interested in the rather spectacular landscape. This is a place that Monet went to paint at Belle Isle, as well as the the more primitive lifestyle, customs, beliefs of the Breton people. Those were seen as picturesque and worthy of uh, being subject to paintings. So Gauguin would go there many times, and I'll show you a few paintings that he made there. This is entitled Still Life with Profile of Laval, dating from 1885. So here's an example of that juxtaposition of different subjects. Uh, the, the profile is that of Charles Laval, a close friend of Gauguin's, but we see very little of him and mostly a still life subject in the center. And the way the fruit has been depicted might remind us of Cézanne. You'll notice the parallel brushstrokes. In the case of Gauguin's, the brushstrokes are much thinner and more refined. The fruit appears to be modeled in colors in places like this, which suggests their roundness, their projection toward us in space. At the same time, they are outlined strongly, so that there's something of a visual conflict, I would say, of an interesting nature in the contradictory suggestions of flatness and three-dimensionality. A couple other works painted there. This is called Four Breton Women from 1886. We see them kind of squeezed together in a way that flattens out the scene. They're pushed up against a background. There are geese here that suggest some depth in space. The overlapping, the truncation of the figures, I think, suggests the influence of Degas. And in fact, Degas was probably the painter among the Impressionists that Gauguin admired the most and learned the most from. Notice there's a male figure back here. It looks like he's carrying a basket. And so it's the contrasted size that suggests depth in space, but otherwise the painting looks quite flat. And one more example, this is from somewhat later, Breton Girls Dancing from 1888. Really a very charming scene. The figures gently turning in space, wearing their distinctive costumes. Here we have a very clear example of the picturesque nature of the Breton landscape and its people. The girls are wearing wooden shoes, and the lace caps that were characteristic of the area. We see piles of hay and a rather flat rendition of space with fragmented buildings and a church steeple in the background. In that painting, and in statements that Gauguin wrote and made verbally in discussions about art at this time, we see him becoming quite critical of Impressionism. Suggesting a very different direction for his own art. In a manuscript entitled Diverses Choses, Diverse Things from 1896, this is somewhat later, he said, the Impressionists study color exclusively insofar as the decorative effect, but without freedom, without retaining the shackles of verisimilitude. For them, the dream landscape created for many different entities does not exist. Of course, that suggests that what Gauguin is interested in is the dream landscape. They look upon and perceive harmoniously, but without any aim. They heed only the eye and neglect the mysterious centers of thought, so falling into merely scientific reasoning. They are the officials of tomorrow, as bad as the officials of today. But this is a complaint against naturalism. Gauguin's statement indicates a focus on or a desire to get at what he calls the mysterious centers of thought, those things that lie under the surface, ideas, emotions, and in an effort to use artistic form, not to portray what's there, but to express those underlying ideas, those mysterious centers of thought. In 1887, he traveled to Panama and Martinique. And I, I seem to recall that in going to Panama, he worked briefly on the construction of the Panama Canal. I tried to confirm that with a little research, but couldn't do so. He was with Charles Laval, who we saw in the painting I showed you. They both became extremely sick. Laval, sickest of all, managed to recover. Um, Gauguin executed a few paintings in Martinique and then returned to France and went to Brittany. So we're looking here on the screen at what he painted in 1888 back in Brittany. There he found the young painter Émile Bernard um, working in the Pont-Aven area and developing a style which became known as Clausonism. Um, the term was coined by a writer named by the name of Edouard Dujardin. Uh, Dujardin was the editor of the Revue Wagnerienne. The term refers to medieval cloisonné objects that Dujardin saw a resemblance to. And so I want to show you what those look like. Here on the right-hand screen is an example of medieval cloisonné. This is a 6th century decorative fibulae, and it's made of soldering pieces of metal together to form little cells, or cloisons in French, and then those are filled in with liquid enamel, which hardens up. So what you have are bright colored shapes. They're solid blue, they're solid red within their very clear boundaries. We might also draw a comparison with medieval stained glass. So here I show you an example of that, where similarly, brightly colored shapes, particularly deep blues, deep reds, are held in place by strips of lead. With the light coming through, the lead forms dark boundaries against those colored shapes. But you can see the strong similarity between that and the art of Gauguin and Bernard. That was the style that was being developed at the time in Brittany. Bernard was later he complained, objected to Gauguin's taking of his ideas without giving him credit and developing them as his own, as we see here in the painting Vision After the Sermon, which dates from 1888. What we see here is a number of Breton women wearing their distinctive lace caps. The title indicates they've heard a sermon, and apparently in that sermon they heard the story of Jacob wrestling with the archangel. And so now, in reflecting on that, it seems in the outdoors they have a vision of that Old Testament conflict. The figure on the right-hand side must be the priest, although the figure has the profile of Gauguin with a monk's tonsure as the treatment of his hair, looking down prayerfully, and we see Jacob and the archangel wrestling in the distance. There is something of a difference to the way the figures are depicted, more naturalistically in the foreground, and then with very artificial colors in the background that suggest this is something seen or something imagined, not something that exists in the real world. We can see here this emerging Clausonist technique in the bold outlining of the figures. That's particularly evident here, the dark lines that surround the wings of the angel, the feet of all four figures. You'll see dark lines elsewhere defining the hands, the hats, clearly. modeling is here reduced to, well, it's eliminated altogether in some places, like none of it on the ground, very little, none on the wings, really. We see a bit of it on the head of the priestly figure and a bit on the caps of the Breton women. But modeling has become a feature of artistic form that Gauguin uses selectively. He uses it where he wishes. He really wants to avoid the appearance of naturalistic betrayal. And so that's a kind of expendable feature of form. We can see him interested here in the inner life of these people, in their naive faith, in their pious visions, and he uses form then, artistic form, subjectively, in order to express that inner mysterious reality. So I show you here a painting that was executed by Bernard in the same year. This is in your textbook, and it's entitled Breton Women in a Meadow, which shows us his version of this emerging Cloisonné style. Notice that the ground is painted in a uniform green color, no gradation that would suggest depth and space, only the decreasing size of the figures, large in the bottom, small at the top, very little modeling. The effect, again, is like stained glass or cloisonné metalwork. And we might compare this yet again to, and this example is mentioned in your textbook, a naturalistic treatment of the same subject. This is by Danya Bouveret, and it's entitled Brittany Pardon, dating from 1886. Now, pardons were religious observances that took place periodically in Brittany, and they were a fascinating subject to artists and writers elsewhere in France. The Breton people would process without shoes, so this is an act of mortification of the flesh, carrying candles. They might walk great distances as a display of piety. And we can see here a kind of almost photographically accurate depiction of this religious ritual. The Breton women wearing their distinctive hats, but notice that they're very precisely painted in a naturalistic or realistic style, with the usual techniques of modeling and accurate perspective. The woman here is seeking alms, and so holding up a tray or a shallow dish to receive alms. So if we go back and make a comparison of the two, you can see just how pronounced is Gauguin and Bernard's deviation from naturalism in seeking a new style that would portray inner life, inner thoughts and emotions. Well, I've got one more work of Gauguin's to show you from this period in Brittany. And this is a portrait entitled Les Miserables. You can see the title down here, The Miserable Ones. Now, this was the outcome of a suggestion by Van Gogh, who had met Gauguin in Paris in 1887, and then continued to correspond with him. By this time, and let's say it's summer, or perhaps as late as September 1888, the idea of an exchange of portraits had been suggested by Van Gogh, which would have included Bernard, Emile Bernard, Gauguin, and Van Gogh. So they were going to paint portraits of themselves and perhaps include a reference to another in this group, if they were present. And and send them to each other. So this portrait was sent from Gauguin to Van Gogh in Arles. It became then the property of Van Gogh. And you can see that Gauguin paints himself, and he includes a drawing taped to the wall of Bernard here in the background. The inscription says, the miserable ones, to friend Vincent, Gauguin, 1888. So Gauguin had an idea here, and he sought to depict himself as a kind of suffering bohemian figure. He describes what he was after. He says, it is, I think, a transformation which has not yet borne fruit, by which will. I've done the self-portrait which Vincent asked for. I believe it is one of my best things, absolutely incomprehensible. It is so abstract, it deviates so much from reality. The head of a bandit in the foreground, a Jean Valjean from Les Miserables, personifying also a disreputable impressionist painter, shackled always to this world. The design is absolutely special, he says about himself, a complete abstraction. The eyes, mouth, and nose are like the flowers of a Persian carpet, thus personifying the symbolic aspect. The color is far from nature. Imagine a vague suggestion of pottery contorted by a great fire. All the reds, violets, striped by flashes of fire like a furnace, radiating from the eyes, seat of the struggles of the painter's thought. The whole on a chrome background strewn with childish flowers. So he's trying to suggest that he's a suffering artist, something like the bandit Jean Valjean in Les Miserables, who is reviled by bourgeois society, hunted, hounded, suffering. You can see the colors of his face are extreme blue shadows and reddish, pinkish, strong, bright pinkish highlight parts of the face. He describes his eyes and mouth and nose being like flowers, and so relates them to a flowered wallpaper in the background. So he's thinking here then about inner idea, and again, quite boldly transforming form, flattening out his body, outlining his clothing with a dark line that separates it from the background, applying colors subjectively in order to convey the idea underlying the conception of the work. One of the topics in the letters going between Gauguin and Van Gogh at this time was the idea pushed by Van Gogh for Gauguin to come to the south of France and to live in Arles in the Yellow Studio, which he did in October, staying until December, just 9 weeks. The two artists argued about all kinds of things, over technique, over color, over painting from the model versus memory, and about the reputation of a number of past artists as useful models. I'm going to show you a couple of comparisons that I showed earlier in talking about Van Gogh, which illustrate the different ideas and approaches and styles of these two artists. So again, here is Gauguin's painting on the left-hand side entitled Les Alice Camp, the Provençal variation of the term Champs-Élysées, and I think I can pull that up down here, Les Alice Camp. And on the right-hand side, Van Gogh's depiction of the same subject. The artists were working a few feet apart, looking in different directions, and Gauguin with rather light, refined brushwork shows us a canal and the banks that surround it. The graveyard, Les Alice Camp, would be down here, and we've got the church in the distance. The colors are certainly strong. The rendition of space is quite flattened, and it's really just the small size of the figures and the church in the distance that gives us a clear idea of or a clearer idea of recession into the distance. Van Gogh's painting, in contrast, is more Japanist in conception, with a strange or odd downward point of view, trees uh, given strong contour lines, filled in with solid colors. And we see prominent complementary contrast, the orange ground versus the blue trees, particularly prominent. Well, one of the things they argued about was complementary colors. Gauguin thought Van Gogh relied too heavily on that formula as a way of organizing a painting. Gauguin thought Van Gogh's technique was sloppy. And we can see that kind of difference between the looser, freer technique of Van Gogh and the more refined brushwork, nice, neat parallel strokes in the Gauguin here on the left-hand side. Um, an issue of particular importance was Gauguin's commitment to painting from memory rather than from the model, and urging Van Gogh to do the same thing. Here another comparison, although the timing is a bit off here. On the right-hand side is Van Gogh's painting of the Night Cafe. You should all recognize this, which had been made before Gauguin arrived. Gauguin's painting of the same subject appears then on the left-hand side, and it's interesting in that we see many of the same things. The blood red walls. Notice that the mirror which you see over here appears in the Gauguin. The pool table, obviously. This is the postmaster Joseph Roulin, who was a good friend of Van Gogh's. We see here somebody's asleep on a table. This looks like a Zouave soldier. And this is Madame Ginou, who was the proprietress. Van Gogh would later paint her portrait a couple times. Gauguin was being a more confident person. He was much more successful in getting people to pose for him. And so he has painted her before Van Gogh was able to do that. She appears in the foreground, smoke in the background. You notice that in contrast to the very heavy strokes, the impasto, a term I did not, I don't think, introduced to you talking about Van Gogh earlier. Impasto means a paste-like, a heavy paste-like buildup of paint on the surface. And that's apparent here in a number of places. The garment of the proprietor, for example. Gauguin's technique is much thinner, more refined. All right, well, there are 9 weeks of arguments in conflict would culminate in Vincent's self-mutilation, his cutting up part of his ear off, or earlobe, and Gauguin leaving. And when he left, he went back to Brittany. And so we're looking here at one of several paintings that he made, taking up Christian subjects. Now, Brittany was full of Calvaries or crucifixes along the roads. And he painted these such that it's hard to tell what is real and what is not. This is entitled The Yellow Christ from 1889. And you'll notice Breton women in their distinctive hats in prayerful poses across the foreground, encircling the crucifix. In the background, then, is a man climbing over a wall, Breton fields, and buildings. The colors are highly artificial. Orange trees, for example, these are saturated, intense colors. There is very little modeling, although again that's used selectively. You see bits of it here and there, but not it's not used consistently. The trees are given decorative shapes, and the space seems quite flattened. This is the Green Christ, I think a particularly beautiful arrangement of colors from the same time period. This is your textbook, and it is Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, but it's also a self-portrait with the facial features, the distinctive nose of Gauguin given to the figure of Christ. Um, this is a part of the passion story of Christ. You'll remember Christ prays for courage, for strength, intimating that he will be taken captive and face crucifixion. He asks a number of disciples to go with him into the garden. They fall asleep while there are a couple figures in the background that would represent the disciples. The landscape very sketchily, very summarily indicated, and in the figure, the downward-looking, sorrowful figure of Christ slash Gauguin. Now, as your textbook points out, I think this is quite a useful interpretation. Artists such as Gauguin and Van Gogh admired the figure of Christ as a man of courage and independence, freedom of thought, and seeing themselves as suffering sort of visionaries, committed to the truth, the, um, um, the sincerity of their projects as painters. They identified themselves to some extent with Christ. Although I think nobody went so far as to give their own features to the figure of Christ as Gauguin did. Notice the hair stands out against its dark background as a solid, unmodulated color, bold outline. So here's an evidence of that Cloisonist approach. And the red color here would seem to indicate passion, suffering. And then one other example of a merger of personal iconography and Christian subject. This is a self-portrait of Gauguin with a halo. A highly symbolic work. We see his head very clearly, and his body seems conflated with this flat orange shape. There are vines, looks like ivy growing up here, but also a snake, which he holds in his hand. In the background, apples and the halo. So it would seem that we've got, basically the underlying idea here is Gauguin torn between good and evil, between a virtuous life and temptations, seductions that he's drawn to, with the snake signifying evil, the halo goodness, and the apples temptation. In 1889, there occurred an alternative exhibition in which Gauguin played a part as one of the organizers. Back in Paris, this was the Café Volpini exhibition. It was held at the same time as the International Exposition for which the Eiffel Tower was built in 1889. The exhibition took place in a cafe, the Café of the Arts, located just outside the official exhibition grounds. And the exhibition was labeled Exhibition by the Impressionist and Synthetist Group. Now, as your textbook explains, synthetism was a word that Gauguin coined. It comes from the French verb synthétiser, to synthesize. And it was a way of giving a name, giving a title to the style that separated the front, that's distinguished from Cloisonnism that Dujardin had coined to describe what Bernard was doing in Brittany. The exhibition was not particularly successful. Little, if anything, was sold. It did not bring Gauguin the attention and the financial support that he needed badly. He was also invited that year to exhibit with the Belgian avant-garde group Les 20, the 20, in Brussels, as was Van Gogh that year. About this time, having seen the people and the customs and the objects from the South Pacific on display at the exhibition in Paris, Gauguin began to formulate the idea of going there, leaving Western civilization behind altogether, and relocating in the South Pacific. He labeled himself a savage. um, and so he sought to extricate himself from Western civilization and the struggles that he faced there, what he regarded as its materialistic degeneracy, and to seek a pure life in a more primitive place. In 1891, he organized a sale of his works at the Hotel Drouot. This is where auctions and artist sales were frequently held. And the sales were sufficient. They weren't great, but sufficient to fund his travel to Tahiti. Located in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. I had to look this up. You might do the same. Tahiti is located um, just south of the equator and pretty much south of Hawaii. So it's really out in the middle of the ocean, in between Australia and South America. Initially, he lived in the capital city. By the way, Tahiti was a French colony, so he could count on his French language, enabling him to survive and to interact with people there. He lived in the capital of Papeete, and then he moved more remotely into the interior, hoping to find there calm, ecstasy, and art. This is in your textbook, a painting that he made in 1891, having recently arrived in Tahiti. It's entitled Two Tahitian Women. And as your textbook explains, it shows the effects of colonization on Tahiti. Gauguin did not find the primitive paradise that he expected, but rather he found that a lot of Western customs and certainly Western religion had already arrived and was bringing about a significant change to the life of the native people in Tahiti. This painting gives evidence of that because we see on the right-hand side a Tahitian woman uh, in, um, uh, in native attire, and on the left-hand side, I'm sorry, this is not the work that's in your textbook. Um, this is a little different. Uh, the native attire is more apparent in the woman on the left-hand side, and if you take a look at the work in your textbook, you'll see that the woman is wearing a more body-covering dress, which was of the type that missionaries were sort of forcing upon, strongly encouraging the Tahitian women to wear in accordance with Western uh, moral views. That woman is also in the other painting, uh, uh, weaving a straw hat, and this was um, a, um, a productive industry that had been introduced by the missionaries um, to to make the Tahitians more productive, so that they might produce something that would be saleable in the outside world. I'll talk about the style here. You notice that the space is greatly flattened, so that while the figure here has foreshortened body parts, the leg, for example, uh, it's because of the lack of modeling, say in the foot, it's um, it's very difficult to see your position in space clearly. The dress is little modeled. Uh, the, um, the forms present have strong outlines and bold colors that really force themselves to the surface. So the painting kind of mediates between suggestions of depth and the and a strong emphasis on the surface, on decoration of the surface. And then this painting is discussed in your textbook as well. And I sent you a description of it by Gauguin entitled Manao Tu Papau, or The Spirit of the Dead Watching, dating from 1892. As Gauguin explains, he returned to his home. He was living with this young woman at the time, and he found her um, staring into space. She didn't seem to recognize him. She seemed, uh, her attention, her consciousness seemed to be directed wholly elsewhere, staring fearfully out into space. And he interpreted this as an awareness of something unseen by him, and a fearful attitude toward it. And this is the painting that he made that that attempted to capture that inner emotion, that mysterious awareness on her part. He tells us that the spirit of the dead watching over her, perhaps threatening her, is embodied in this figure in the background, and that the background was a violet purple color, sown with flowers growing like electric sparks. We see them here. A strange figure sits by the bed. The coloring is quite exotic. Purples, blues, with a boldly contrasting pattern in yellow, and the figure looks out toward us. In this case, the figure is modeled quite richly. Lots of variation in browns and yellows and pinks. So here we have one of the most vivid examples of his attempt to convey something that's wholly interior and to manipulate visual form toward that end. Van Gogh returned to Paris in 1893 and spent about 2 years there. He continued to paint even exotic Polynesian subjects while in Paris. This is called Day of the God, dating from 1894. You can see the colors, particularly those in the foreground, are highly subjective. A variety of motifs are gathered together here, which include making music. The big tray of food suggests feasting, dancing. And here we have a kind of symmetrical, iconic arrangement of 3 figures in the foreground that perhaps suggests the circle of life. Modeling used somewhat selectively, and the shapes boldly outlined and filled in with highly subjective colors. In Paris, he affected a flamboyant persona. While living in Brittany, briefly, he was beaten by sailors in Le Poldu there, and spent time recovering in the hospital. His Javanese mistress stole his possessions, anything of value, and fled. So basically, his life was a mess. He was not the successful artist that people flocked to and gave attention to that he thought he might be. And so he held another sale of his works at the Hotel Drouot in 1895 and returned to Tahiti. He worked briefly there at a desk job. In 1887, hearing that his favorite child, his daughter Aline, had died, he was sick himself and broke. He decided to paint his last will and testament to poison himself and die. And this is the result of that effort, a painting entitled, Where Do We Come From? Who Are We? And Where Are We Going? One of his most famous works. The work is about 4.5 feet long by 12 feet, 4.5 feet high by 12 feet in length. So a big painting, a big statement. He says that he painted it without any studies, painted it in one passionate, prolonged effort. It took about a month to do, and here we have the result. It did not stink of the studio, is the way he put it, but was rather the uncontaminated emanation from his passion effort. It's a mysterious painting. And he does offer an explanation of it, which is somewhat helpful. Uh, there are young, old, and middle-aged figures here. So it does contain a pretty clear reference to the stages of life. Notice there's a baby over here, watched over by three women. There's a young child here in the center, and an old woman on the left-hand side. So if we read the painting, in this case, from left to middle to right, or right to left to middle to left, we read toward the left, then we do see something of the unfolding of life. Um, there is a figure here lifting her arm in the middle. Uh, Gauguin says she is quite intentionally bigger than she should be. Um, so she does not conform to the laws of perspective. And she looks toward two women who are interacting, discussing something rather somberly as they walk toward the right. The figure in the center, perhaps the most prominent figure, reaches up to grasp an apple. But this suggests a number of things, perhaps the need for human beings to work, the effort required to survive, to feed oneself. This is simply the nature of life. It also suggests the biblical tale of the eating of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and what resulted from that, according to the myth or the biblical biblical account. That is things like having to work, but also suffering and death, but also knowledge. Um, the apple came from the tree of knowledge, so Adam and Eve gained awareness from that um, violation of their instructions. There are animals scattered about, goats and cats. Here's a goose over here. So the animal nature of human beings, our connection with the animals of the world, the creatures of the world, is suggested. Uh, Aside from this reference to Western religion, there is an idol here, hands raised upward, that's clearly of an icon from a South Pacific religious tradition. So the human need for religion of one kind or another, or the human need to explain our existence, to explain our origins and our fates, is referenced here through religion. The setting of all these human figures and their actions is an exotic one. This looks like Tahiti or Polynesia, a kind of tropical paradise with beautiful, rich colors. The human figures with their yellowish bodies stand out sharply from the darker bluish surroundings. There is something like a mountain that seems to rise up here in the distance, but we also see the water here intervening between this mountain-like form and here a mountain behind the idol. The title is written over here in French. Where are we going? Where do we come from? Who are we and where are we going? And Gauguin has signed the work on the right-hand side. So this was to be his last will and testament. He says that he then took poison and tried to commit suicide, but he resulted only in making himself very sick. He did recover and moved in 1901 to the Marquesas Islands. These are islands about 1,000 miles from Tahiti to the northeast, so a little closer to South America. He found there a more primitive, a less culture and a way of living less affected by Western influence. There he died in 1903, and there he's buried. So particularly in works like we see on the screen here, mysterious works that are difficult to understand if we come at this with conventional Western expectations. They're about inner thoughts, inner emotions. We see in these works the origins of symbolism, and that term was already applied to Gauguin during his lifetime by critics such as Aurier. And he's seen really as the father of symbolism. a way of painting, a way of thinking about art that would be continued by many other artists, some of whom I'll mention in a later lecture.